Welcome to the CEC Report. It's August 24. I'm Robert Barwick and I'm joined again by CEC leader Craig Isherwood. Welcome, Craig.
Thanks, Robbie.
In today's CEC Report, first, pussy rot. Media created martyrs to attack Russia. Second, China's slowdown spells Olympic catastrophe for the Australian economy. And finally, Australia's banks win silver but paid in Australian lives. So first, pussy rot. Media spun martyrs to attack Russia. Craig, I've got a question for you. What the hell would Madonna know about political prisoners?
Well, obviously, Robbie, nothing.
I'm asking that because we have to set the record straight. This is, the whole of the Western world is being bombarded by media spin that is making out the Russian punk rock band called Pussy Riot to be martyrs. And this spin is being fronted by all these celebrities, which of course adds the mantle of truth to what's being said. And they are Madonna, Paul McCartney, Sting, and backed up by the Obama White House. The target of this is Vladimir Putin. Not to oust Vladimir Putin.
No.
Because it won't.
It won't, no.
His support's too strong. But to soften us up, to not blink at all, not batter an eyelid, when the British and Obama get their war going against Russia, which is what they're going for.
Yeah, it's designed to make people say, "Oh, isn't that Putin a horrible fella?" I mean, this is how politics gets reduced down to public opinion.
It's like.
Or in this case, maybe pubic opinion, given that it's Pussy Riot.
We've covered here before. There's a journalist, Alan Howe, in the Herald Sun, Murdoch's Herald Sun here, that Murdoch brought over from his union-busting strike force in Wapping in England many years ago. And Alan Howe has stated in the Herald Sun in Melbourne that Vladimir Putin is the same as Adolf Hitler. And they just put this garbage out there so that when they get their war going on Russia, which is what they want to do, then we just will think, well, of course, we've got to do it. Here are the facts, and I'm going to go through them. There's a few, so I'm going to go through them very efficiently. This ban flagrantly desecrated the area of a Russian Orthodox church containing the sacred icons where only the priests are allowed, and they were cavorting and gyrating their punk rock music, singing loudly to the Virgin Mary to rid Russia of Vladimir Putin. And of course they did it in a Russian Orthodox church because they were attacking the church's support of Vladimir Putin. This was not the arrest of this ban was not an act that Putin ordered. They broke a law, an existing law of hooliganism under Russian law. Now under this law, you can get jailed. The sentence is 3 years for an individual or 7 years if it's an organised group. Right? So this group got 2 years. The prosecutor asked for 3 under the law. The judge imposed 2 minus double the time already served. They've been in prison for 5 months. So take 10 months off 2 years. 14 months is their effective sentence. Far less than the 7 years that they could have got under existing Russian law that Vladimir Putin didn't, right? Yep. Members of this band, it's not as innocent as people like to think.
Yeah, well, this is not an innocent bunch of girls, and I think when you see the footage of balaclava hooded
and we can only use
kids,
a limited amount of footage that's available, and I don't encourage anyone to look at it, but it's there. Some members of this band belong to a group called Voina. Now, Voina is very notorious in Russia. They specialise in flash mobs, if you know what flash mobs are, where people will turn up at a certain place at a certain time, and in their case for group sex orgies all in the public. They specialised in simulating sex acts of bestiality with stuffed bears and frozen chickens in public places, including in front of children. And some of the exact girls that are in jail now for Pussy Riot came out of that group, right? There's been coordinated parallel protests to the Pussy Riot protests. A topless member of what's known as Femin, which is this group of women in Russia that do these topless protests, she used a chainsaw in the Ukraine to cut down a church cross. The thing is, though, this is a cross that was erected to commemorate the church victims the victims of Stalin's oppression of the church in the 1930s. This is not just any cross, a religious icon. This is a commemorative cross. Probably the more interesting parallel protest is in Cologne in Germany. Pussy Riot sympathisers pulled a similar stunt in that cathedral, and guess what? They face 3 years jail under German law.
Yeah.
But nobody is saying that Germany is a dictatorship. That this proves Germany is a dictatorship, like they're saying it applies to Russia. And the fact Russia's president, Putin's only role in this, was he urged the court to be easy on Pussy Riot, and they were, because he just said they're young, right? But he made this point. He noted that they were fortunate they did what they did in Moscow, and they didn't do it in a synagogue in Israel or in a mosque in the North Caucasus, because if they had done it in those places, they wouldn't have made it to jail.
Yeah.
As he said, there's very tough people in those kind of areas. The main fact, though, to highlight is Pussy Riot, Femin, and the rest are being directed from Oxford University's Project Democracy, and they're using, line by line, the Gene Sharp playbook of 198 methods of non-violent action. And Gene Sharp's a Project Democracy guru who specialises in counterinsurgencies, in running insurgencies. And these, I'll just name some of the things that Gene Sharp, in these 198 steps that Pussy Riot are using. Number 27, new signs and names. Number 30, step 30, rude gestures. 32, taunting officials. 161, non-violent harassment. 178, guerrilla theatre, because of course they film everything they do. Craig, the big paradox in all of this is that Vladimir Putin was democratically elected. And even the Western media in Russia, I was monitoring at the time of the election, the Western media grudgingly admitted that his support among the everyday Russian people is huge, especially outside of the sort of like the urban elite of Moscow. But his support among the Russian people is enormous.
Well, there's very good reasons for that.
Exactly, and I want you to come back, but it proves to explain those reasons, but also it proves this democracy angle of, Project Democracy is saying Russia's anti-democratic is a sham. So why do the Anglo-American interests hate Putin so much?
Because Putin is standing up, Robbie, against this idea of globalisation. He's actually, there's a doctrine which is attributed to him called the Putin doctrine, which is basically the idea of national sovereignty. So wherever you look at the Russian government now led by Putin in the United Nations, or their actions to support the Syrian government or the Iranian government, it's around the issue of national sovereignty, and these external third parties, these paid elements, represent a threat to national sovereignty.
And Russia's position on the principle of national sovereignty is the traditional world position for 400 years since the Treaty of Westphalia. It's from Tony Blair onwards in Britain that they've used things like the Iraq War, etc., to try and tear that up and totally overthrow that doctrine and replace it with a globalist doctrine.
Look, and you said before, yeah, that's right, exactly right. Because look, today the entire world is governed by this idea of globalisation. You don't have nation states, right? If you don't have nation states, you can then strip the means to support the population.
Private financial powers are more powerful than any national government.
And that's been played out because the other policy that we've talked about regularly on this program is population reduction. The likes of Prince Philip, Hans Schellenhuber, someone that we've featured on the show before, want to reduce the world's population down to below 1 billion. Hans Schellenhuber is the hand-picked knighted person of the Queen that goes around the world speaking about population reduction.
Tim Flannery's buddy.
Tim Flannery's buddy. Now, I want to cast this quickly into a historical light because I looked at this natural population growth of Russia, and what you see is in the post-1985 a complete collapse in the natural growth of the population. Now, that is because of what Mr. LaRouche put on the table in 1982, 83, and then up to 85. It's called the Strategic Defence Initiative, which was rejected by the Russians. So they actually tried to turn their economy into this vast military machine, and it ended up, as Mr. LaRouche said, destroying their internal economy. Now, once their economy was destroyed, of course, the Berlin Wall fell down, communism fell apart, but you see a major collapse in not only just population growth, but you see a rise in the death rates in the population. Now, this is from the 1990s through to about 2000. The death rate hasn't been stopped yet, but Putin recognises that this is a big problem.
And that was under shock, what the West called shock therapy.
Shock therapy. This is Western policy and economic rationalism. Exactly the same people like Lord Harris of Highcross that we uncovered here in Australia was running the program in Russia.
And I saw Western media reports on the Russian elections in February where they would survey local Russians, everyday Russians, and say, why do you support Putin? And their answer was not because of something that Putin was promising to do, but because Putin stopped them from dying.
Yeah, I mean, the death rate's still pretty bad in Russia, but it's acknowledged by the Russian population that he stopped the criminality of this economic rationalist policies coming in, shock therapy.
The natural growth rate has started going up. It's just not back up to where it was.
Yeah, and that's because of the policies that have come in under Medvedev and under Putin in the last period. So what is really at the crux of this matter is that Putin has demonstrated that he stands for national sovereignty. The Chinese demonstrate that they're a sovereign nation state. The Indians have to some degree. So you're seeing a shift economically also, and through the banking system, you're seeing a shift towards, a stronger Russia. It's not great shakes by any means. A China that's becoming very strong economically, and of course India, which is developing. And in the backdrop of a collapsing Atlantic monetary system like Greece, Portugal, and all those countries, Spain, for example, the British monetary system is disintegrating. And this, Putin, because he stands for national sovereignty, the policies that can save nation states, is actually seen as a major threat.
Yep. All right. We have to leave it there. When we come back, we're going to talk about how China's slowdown spells an Olympic catastrophe for the Australian economy. Welcome back to the CEC Report. China's slowdown spells Olympic catastrophe for the Australian economy. So, Craig, just like in ancient Babylon with Belshazzar and the writing on the wall, Australia got a very clear writing on the wall this week when BHP announced it's mothballing its Olympic Dam project, which would have been basically the biggest mine in the world, Olympic Dam.
The actual mine site, Robbie, is the same size as the Adelaide CBD area. Incredible.
Just incredible. Copper and gold and etc. Why? Well, prices for the two staple commodities that have kept Australia going, iron ore and coal, are dropping. I think iron ore is down from $140 to $117, and it's heading south. Other commodities are following it, and it's all on the back of China's slowdown. So Aussies should enjoy Gina Rinehart's wealthiest woman in the world tag while it lasts, Craig, because she's about to do an Icarus and plunge back to Earth. So the question is, why is China slowing? China's slowing because it has an unbalanced economy. It based its miracle economy on allowing its population to be used to cheaply manufacture goods for the West. Now, it wasn't totally stupid. It also built incredible infrastructure that fundamentally lifted its living standard.
Yeah, things like the magnetic levitation train systems and their high-speed rail networks, which are phenomenal.
And they're committed to more of that. The structural weakness, though, is the funding for all that depends on their foreign income from exporting manufactured goods.
To the United States, Australia, and Europe. And look what's taking place in Greece and Spain. Again, these things are highly interconnected.
So in other words, China's customers are bankrupt, and therefore China's in trouble. And the problem for Australia is, if China sneezes, we get pneumonia.
Which we've been talking about this, Robbie, for the last year, exactly this scenario, where as the prices were rising and Gina Reinhardt was becoming the world's richest woman, we were saying, this is going to end. And a lot of people were sceptical about that, but look, it's now happening.
Well, and let's remind people, because, we get so much spin and propaganda from the government about our prosperous economy and how great we are compared to everyone else. But there was a little window in late 2008, early 2009, at the height of the GFC, when Kevin Rudd whipped out his $900 stimulus, etc. Little window where Australia fell to its knees. And it fell to its knees because China stopped importing. China's factories closed, China had its own crisis on, it stopped importing, world shipping ground to a halt. There's photos you can see, I don't know if we were able to put one up, of this port of Singapore that looks like a traffic jam because all shipping stopped. And they measure shipping on what's called the Baltic Dry Index, and that index dropped 90%. Imagine That's an index of shipping activity. Imagine if the Dow Jones dropped 90%. That's what happened in a few months in 2008. And when that happened, China also stopped importing our resources. And I remember especially the Queensland government would remember how much that destroyed their budget, which was totally dependent on royalties from coal exports, etc. So that turned around though, not because of Rudd's stimulus, but because China announced $1 trillion stimulus based on building infrastructure. That's what they did then. But they still haven't got over their structural weakness. And we've got to look at our role in this, Craig. So my question to you is, if our national prosperity as a nation hinges on the state of a foreign economy, is that real prosperity at all?
Well, go back. You have to answer that question, Robbie. You've got to go back to 1975 to the Whitlam era. And you have to go back to what Whitlam was actually trying to do. Now, Whitlam was like the last gasp of old Labor that actually represented the idea that a sovereign nation state has to control the means of its productions, which includes raw materials.
And better than Whitlam himself were some of the people around him, like Rex Connor.
Yeah, Rex Connor, the minister under Whitlam.
Minerals and Energy Minister.
And they intended to buy back the farm. They intended to buy the Australian resource companies. They intended to buy back rural properties, whatever is required in order to stabilise the national resource base for Australia. And they went outside the British banking system to do that. And what happened?
They got crushed.
The biggest institutional investor in Rio Tinto, the Queen of England, sacked Whitlam. Now people say, oh, she wouldn't do that directly. No way. Oh, come on. That politics doesn't work that way. Of course, she's not going to be up there up front. She'll do it through cutouts, and the Sir John Kerr was a very good cutout for that. But the intention was to not allow sovereign control of resources. And look what's happened now. The huge looting operation, the so-called two-speed economy. It's not a two-speed economy. You can't live in these regional towns anymore. You can't afford the rent. There's no real profit of the workers.
No way.
It's just a pure looting operation. Now, China's been stockpiling iron ore for a long time. It's got millions upon millions of tons of stockpiled ore in its ports and so forth, and you see the price of iron ore is dropping, like you said. It's expected to go down below $100 a tonne, and therefore this so-called two-speed economy is going to become one-speed economy, and look, we've just lost all this manufacturing capacity. This is the problem with the policies of globalisation.
And it was a deliberate policy. The Treasury officials for a couple of years, and people like the Productivity Commission, as we've said here, have been saying, don't prop up manufacturing anymore, let's just go with resources. That's where our future is. Well, is it?
Yeah, that's why we as a political party have called for the renationalisation of these real assets, and then the development of industries that process those ores, like, for example, aluminium. Instead of shipping out our bauxite, let's produce more aluminium. Robbie, that means we've got to have more power. Aluminium smelting is a very highly intensive electrical process.
Just as an aside, Craig, the people who run the national electricity market in Australia are bragging about how they've met targets for reducing power consumption in Australia because smelters have shut down.
And so when you look at this idea of prosperity, right, if we're moving in the direction of simply trying to rely on shipping raw materials out, we are going downhill fast, and we're about to find out more in the coming weeks and months about what this actually means.
We need to look seriously at going back and manufacturing for ourselves again, because that's where real wealth actually comes from.
And there's plenty we can do.
All right, well, except we can't talk about it anymore because we're out of time.
Oh, okay.
So when we come back, we're going to talk about how Australia's banks have won silver. Welcome back to the CEC Report. And finally this week, Australia's banks win silver, but it's paid for in Australian lives. So research last week, that was released last week by the Bank of America Merrill Lynch, showed the extraordinary statistic, Craig, that by one measure, which is the combined value of all their shares, Australia has the second largest banking system in the world after the US.
That means what you're talking about is if you take the value of the shares on the stock market, Robbie, like I think Commonwealth Bank's around the 52, 53, and you multiply it by the number of shares, and then add that up for the other banks as well. Yeah. Wow.
So the market value or the capitalisation of our banks is second only after America. That means it's bigger than all of the banks in Britain. It's bigger than all the banks in the Eurozone, which is however many nations that is, all of the banks in China, all of the banks in Japan. So, as I said, once again, Australia wins silver. And you'll have some Aussies will be going, Aussie, 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 oi, oi, oi. But there's a problem here. Australia has 0.3% of the world's population, yet the wealth of our banks accounts for 8% of the world's banking system. My question to you, Craig, is it any wonder that Australians feel crushed by their debt?
Well, Robbie, as soon as you said $50 per share, that's capitalisation, the immediate thing is that what's the assets of the banking system? What actually underpins that value? Well, that's housing mortgages. We've had a housing bubble in this country for, 10 years
Based
now?
on inflated values, yeah.
Based on inflated values. So the value of the shares is based on inflated housing values. And also, you've got this problem where something like $513 billion of our bank's debt, I think something like $700 billion there too, is borrowed less than 180 days overseas. So not only have you got this huge overcapitalisation per population, you've got these huge debt problems and massive exposures to the property market. So this is a real alarming situation, and it's no wonder that there's never talked about.
No.
There's definite science about these particular issues, except for when we raise them, because what we say is our system is bankrupt.
Think about this. The Commonwealth Bank's profit this year is $10 billion. Now, when they were sold in the first half of the 90s, between 91 and 96, they were sold. That bank was sold for $8 billion. They've just made a 1 year's profit of $10 billion. But where's that come from? The combined profit of all the banks in Australia this year is $23 billion. That's $1,000 for every man, woman and child in Australia. That's being extracted out of us.
Yeah.
So in other words, they are looting. They're milking the Australian population to support these profits.
Yeah. Well, you said before it's $23 billion that the banks have made. Robbie, look at what that can build in our country. Instead, it's going into the hands of basically a lot of it's going overseas, obviously.
Now, Craig, all these profits for the Australian banking system have come post the privatisation of the Commonwealth Bank, because when it was a national bank, and not even a fully functional one like we advocate, but just a government-owned bank, it forced the banks to compete with it. So you had proper banking services in every town in Australia, and most banks had branches there, so you had thousands more people employed by the banks. You had a bank that would the Commonwealth Development Bank, other aspects of the Commonwealth Bank would make priority investments into industries in Australia.
It's actually chartered to have to do that.
Exactly. So the system worked as a service to keep the economy going. That's all gone now, and now they can just extract. We are servicing this, and Australians think it's a good thing.
Well, that's the problem, is that most Australians want to rail against the banks, and they want to, it's in popular circles, it's a good rant. But the issue is we've got to have a national banking system, and that means fighting for national sovereignty, of looking at what the actual solutions are, which we represent in our papers and so forth and on our website. So I can only urge people to educate themselves and begin to question a lot of what they take for granted, Robbie.
Exactly. And I think it's another example, Craig, where, as we talked about last week, Glass-Steagall, banking separation, should be on the cards here. But we've run out of time. So viewers, thanks for tuning in again to the CEC Report, and we'll be here again next week.